Hi, everybody. I'm Carl Harrington. I'm currently the head of fundraising for the IWMF, and my pleasure now is to introduce Dr. Castillo, but not yet, because I could do this in 9 words, but I'm going to do a lot more. So I want to know how many of you have seen him as your doctor? Raise your hand. Okay, how many of you seen him as a consultant? So a lot of you, and how many of you heard him present before? Okay, so I got a tough job introducing him, so I'm not going to introduce him. I'm going to tell you a story. Okay, so this happened in 2019 in Philadelphia at the last real Ed Forum we had before COVID. And at that time, I was the volunteer president and CEO, and I had a lot of stress. And this accentuated itself on Monday before the Ed Forum was going to start on Friday. On Monday, I got a call from a doctor who was supposed to be presenting on Friday morning. And he informed me that he wasn't presenting, and he informed me that he hadn't done his slides. This was a stress inducer. And what I did is, of course, I had a lot of experience. I spent like 5 or 6 summers working at a paper mill in upstate New York. So I used my extensive cursing language, and I think I might have invented a couple of new ones. But after that, I then sprung into action, and I called Dr. Castillo. And he was going to speak on Friday at 2. I said, hey, how would you like to also speak at 10? And he immediately said, well, sure. And I said, well, we don't have any slides for that. Well, how would you like to do them? And he said, okay. So the next day, on Wednesday now, I think it is, he calls me back and he says, okay, I've got the slides done. But my wife is also, she's an eminent doctor also in diabetes in Boston, and she's out of town at something else. So I'm bringing my kids. Okay. So then I have visions of him running through the airport in Boston, running through the airport in Philly with his 5-year-old son and his 7-year-old daughter in tow. And so I also then talk to Dr. Mattis and say, hey, if he doesn't show up, can you be ready? So now it's 9:53 in the morning. He's speaking at 10. I'm miking Dr. Mattis up in the back, and he comes with his kids. This is a stress reducer. And actually, it turns out to be his son, who's 5 now. And his son, Dr. Castillo is from Peru, and his wife is from Lebanon. So his son knows how to say that WM word in 3 languages. The whole word. I mean, you notice I never say that word. Occasionally I'll say Waldenstrom's, but that other one, nah. So now his 5-year-old is telling me what his dad does. And so anyway, I get Dr. Castillo up there, and my wife has now got like her dream job. She's babysitting his kids, or maybe they're babysitting her. I don't know, but she has more fun. Philadelphia is still her favorite Ed Forum. And you know, near the City Hall, those of you who are there, they've got those little fountains. We got his permission to actually take his children outside of the building, and she took them over there. She had drawing class. She had a ball. Anyway, what I could have said at the beginning was just this. Dr. Castillo is a great doctor. Dr. Castillo is a great friend of the IWMF, and Dr. Castillo is a great father. And with that, I'll have him demonstrate those things. And while he's come up here, there's one more thing I'm going to say to you at the end, because I've got a surprise announcement that even he doesn't know about yet. That's nothing, it's very directly related to what he's talking about.
Oh, Carl. Long and unnecessary. But thank you. That brought me nice memories. It was actually, my kids were very sad that they couldn't come this year. they were walking in, and I was like, hey, saying hi to everybody. And they were like, Dad, how many friends do you have? Like, oh, a bunch. Yeah. So yeah, it's glad to be back. And I typically talk, how to treat, diagnose, prognosticate Waldenstrom's. Today, the presentations will be just a little bit different. When I talk about something different. The way this is different, I would say, at least for me personally, is because I just turned 50 a few weeks ago. A lot of people do that. It's not like skill. Well, there's some skill involved, I agree. But thank you. So, believe it or not, you start thinking about, what's going to be your legacy, right, up to some degree. And, I like to believe that we lead a very important, big practice for patients with Waldenstrom's. I like to believe that we do significant research, not only in the laboratory, but also in the clinic, advancing new medications for patients with Waldenstrom's that hopefully are going to impact, quality of life and survival and all that. But then how can we just go beyond that up to some degree? And this is where this concept came into place. The idea of the clinical trials network is not new. So I just want to make sure that, I'm not that original. But initially there was a clinical trials group that was actually led by Stephen Treon years ago. And it was a very productive clinical trials group. And the whole purpose of that group was to run studies in patients with Waldenstrom's at several centers at the same time in a way that will facilitate enrollment. And I think it makes sense, given the rarity of the disease and the number of different options that are coming up. I think that actually made sense. The CTG or the WMCTG doesn't exist anymore. And I think one of the reasons for that is not the lack of interest from the physicians or the patients, but rather regulatory issues, and funding and things of that nature. So politics, sometimes get into place and, kind of block or inhibit sometimes, what we want to do for our patients. So what I had in my mind is how can we, structure with how things work today. Today, 2024, the world is a very different world, than what it was 20 years ago. Not only, financially and socially and geopolitically and all that. So how can we create something, that is has the same essence of the clinical trials group, but in a way that is, more modern in terms of how we do things today, and also something that could be permanent, or at least more persistent, right? That it will not just die off, just because of other problems. So make it consistent, solid, and self-sufficient up to some degree on its own right. So when we think about that, clinical trials are the life of what we do at Dana-Farber, and actually that was the main reason Stephen Treon hired me now 10 years ago to lead the clinical trials program. I was coming out of a master's in clinical research from Brown. I wanted to lead a clinical trials program, and that was what I wanted to do. That was my training. And the opportunity came up, right, to lead this program. And for me, it was like a perfect fit. For Steve, I think it was a perfect fit too. He wanted to move away from the clinic into the laboratory after the discovery of the MYD88s and in the midst of discovering the CXCR4 mutation. So, his laboratory was going to get so busy, he needed somebody to actually take on the clinic. So I took the clinic about 10 years ago. I walked in, and the first thing I told Steve was like, dude, how can you make a life, academic life, with such a rare disease? How many patients can you possibly have in your cohort? And he was like, we have about 1,000 patients. Like, whoa. So that alone, for me, was an important thing, right? My second concern was that, coming from seeing all lymphomas, getting into just treating one condition, I was worried about the clinical variety will not be there, right? I mean, you see T-cell lymphomas and B-cell lymphomas, and some of them are aggressive, HIV disease and things like that. That's what I was doing before I joined the Dana-Farber group. So I was worried that it wasn't this young once disease, it was be kind of homogeneous and maybe, monotonous. I was wrong. I was wrong. So they gave me 3 months to decide if I wanted to stay in that position that was being offered. Within 3 weeks, I was decided, right? So from anemia to hyperviscosity to cryoglobulins to cold agglutinins to Bing-Neal syndrome, I mean, all these different clinical features. I see anywhere between 14 and 16 patients in one clinic day at Dana-Farber, and they all have different features. It's like they have different diseases. So that, for me, that was perfect. So clinically speaking, it really matched my interest, and the clinical research aspect of things was just like the perfect way to go from my perspective. So over the last decade, we have been very productive in terms of clinical trials, and this is just few examples of what we have done over the last 10 years, with Stephen Trion's guidance and obviously, the work and effort that we have put together. We are now a much bigger group. I mean, we are now actually 2 full-time clinicians at Dana-Farber, just dedicated to Waldenstrom's, Dr. Shena Saroshek, who could not be here for this meeting, but some of you have seen and some of you have seen speaking. She's very interested too in clinical trials, and we are working together very, very well. This is the 4th year that she has been actually at Dana-Farber, which is, I think, is impressive. And I don't want to say much more than maybe when I need a 3rd one very soon, because the practice keeps growing and we keep seeing more patients. So our database now involves almost 4,000 patients that we have seen over the last 2 decades. So that's an impressive amount of data that we have right there. So as successful as we have been doing these clinical trials in the past, I have noticed a change in how things operate, and I think maybe catalyzed, accelerated by the whole pandemic, in which clinical trial participation has kind of become a little bit more problematic. And I don't think it's because of the lack of interest of the patients themselves or the lack of interest of the clinicians themselves, but it's just how difficult sometimes it is for patients to go from one place to the next to participate in a clinical trial, right? So with that in mind, I started thinking, how can we make our trials more accessible to people, number one. Number two, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but there is a European consortium for Waldenstroms, and they have been running now for almost 6-7 years. They're extremely successful as well, running specific studies. I think the reality in Europe is just a little bit different than the reality in the United States, right? If you are a German citizen and you have Waldenstroms and you go to one of these academic centers in Germany, you will have 2 options, the standard option and the clinical trial option, and it's only one clinical trial that is being run everywhere. So in that scenario, it's very easy to enroll patients in clinical trials. What happens in the United States is a little bit different. If you are a patient of the Mayo Clinic, you will go to the Mayo and they will talk to you about the standard treatments and the clinical trial portfolio that they have, which might be different than the clinical trial portfolio that we have at Dana-Farber. It might be different than the clinical trial portfolio that MD Anderson has. So you have one patient and there are multiple options, and those options are all very distinct and disparate up to some degree. So that is a good and a bad thing. It's a good thing because that gives options to patients. And that means you have many different options and you can choose, right? And that's, I think there's value to it. But on the other hand, it does affect a little bit, how quickly can we then enroll a clinical trial? Because instead of having one patient being a candidate for one study, you have one patient being a candidate for 10 different trials, potentially, hypothetically, right? So that makes things a little bit more challenging in terms of how to enroll patients in clinical trials, and so are we competing for the patients, given the rarity of the numbers, and how then can we really create something more sustainable in that specific regard? So with that in mind, started thinking about creating a network of clinical trialists or researchers in the United States, clinical researchers, to kind of sit down and come up with ideas in terms of how to run the studies, make a little bit more homogeneous the whole inclusion criteria, the exclusion criteria. How do we treat the patients? How do we, so basically create a homogeneous idea of what Waldenstrom's is, but also get the input from different doctors in terms of how we can run clinical trials and other research projects in a reasonable way in which, we can actually create a more unified approach to Waldenstrom so everybody benefits from this. So what we have created, and this is the mission of the WMNet, this is the new name of this, is actually to create a sustainable think tank. So we have met a couple of times, and I can give you more details about our meetings a little bit later. But so far, we have about 20 different academic centers with one representative from each center interested in running studies and clinical trials in patients with Waldenstrom's. So the idea is to support, for the think tank, to support the clinical research collaborations in patients with Waldenstrom's. That's the mission of the study. And this mission, has changed a little bit since the initial concept, about a year ago. And, as we meet with people, get ideas, things change a little bit. But this is what the mission of this WMNet is all about. And the vision at the end, I think, is to improve the lives of patients with Waldenstrom's through scientifically driven clinical research, right? So, I mean, I think I understood that we will not be able to do this in an isolated manner. I mean, nobody can do anything in an isolated manner. But there are a few things that you can do in an isolated manner. But most things you cannot do in an isolated manner. Things that make a difference, right? So this is where, we had an idea, and we brought it to the IWMF. And we said, what, this is something that we think could potentially make a difference for patients with Waldenstrom's in the United States, given that there was, I believe, a series of unmet needs that were not being met with the current structure the way it was, right? So these are the different institutions that we have already met. And I mean, some of them probably are closer to you, and some others might not. But as you can see, we have a nice, I would say, diverse distribution of different participants, in the network. And so we have met already a couple of times. We met in Cambridge in October. We hosted that meeting. And we have met recently in New York as well, just a few weeks ago. During the initial meeting, the idea, at least from my perspective, was to kind of get a sense of what the researchers think, the ideal clinical trial is all about, right? Because people can have different perspectives. And not only that, I also gave opportunity. I mean, the design of the agenda on that meeting was to have, pharmaceutical companies come and present their portfolios to see what actually matched better the interest of the Waldenstrom's group, and also have concepts, clinical trial concepts of each and different members of the network to be reviewed, to be voted on, so we can actually, start working together and how we can actually get these trials actually done. So as it stands today, I'm the director of the network, and at least for the foreseeable future, I'll be in that position. We are actively hiring a project manager. The role of this project manager is essentially to provide all the support that is necessary for any member of the network to have documentation ready as soon as possible. For example, if Colorado Blood Cancer Institute comes up with a great idea and it gets voted by the group that is the next idea to come forward, then it will be a network trial. And as it will be the network trial, then the project manager will then take things into her or his or their hands, and at that moment create a protocol that will follow, all the basic standard criteria to create a protocol in a uniform manner. For example, if the Mayo Clinic comes with another idea later on, then we will use a very similar template to use that to develop the protocol for that specific study. And the same thing for the consent forms, the same thing for the adverse event reports, the same thing for the FDA submissions, IRB submissions. So all these documentations are so varied and different from one place to the other, but I think creating a sense in which one institution can actually, or one person can actually look at all these, submissions and make them uniform, I think that's important. That also will uniformize the data collection, right? So for example, if one center runs a study and a different center runs the same study, they're going to have to use the same data collection tools. So in that way, different trials can speak to each other. So different centers can speak to each other, and then over trials, the trials can speak to each other too, right? I think one of the more difficult parts that we have sometimes when we want to have, let's say, pulling data from different studies is that they have different time points, they have different criteria, and it's just so heterogeneous that at the end we cannot sometimes come with a very nice consolidated effort. And I think that is the idea behind this. So that's the purpose of this project manager. The position has been posted. We already have about 25 applicants. So I'm going to have to review all those CVs and letters of recommendation. And hopefully, in the near future, we'll have a project manager ready to support the network as it is. And half a research coordinator, hopefully the upper half. I'm just kidding. So it will be, a research coordinator, and that will support, the project manager in terms of drafting documents, preparing reports, and things like that. We will support manuscript writing. We'll support abstract preparation, poster drafting. So anything that is necessary, really, to take the idea from design, from the clinical trial, from design all the way to reporting, and and everything in between. So that's the idea. We do have a meeting planner already hired, and she's a person, Lorraine. She's a person who basically has been working with us, making sure that everybody is there in place and all the agendas. So those two positions are it, but the other two positions are very, soon to be filled, and I think that will take the staff, at least the initial staff, put in place. Now, I just wanted to give you an idea of what the clinical trials that we are currently running as network trials. So the first study is a study led by Dr. Shena Saroshek at Dana-Farber. So this study is actually using a very novel antibody drug conjugate called loncastuximab. This is already registered, and as you can see, that it's registered because it's an NCT number. That means there's a clinical trial ID assigned to this drug itself. Loncastuximab is an FDA-approved medication already for aggressive lymphomas, and we are using it now for Waldenstrom's. So this is going to be the first formally known network study. We actually had very recently the site visit, which is the initiation visit for the Fred Hutch through Dr. Mary Kwok, and we will be having very soon the initiation visit with Dr. Kapoor at the Mayo Clinic. So we'll have 3 different centers running that study at the same time. The status of this study is active enrolling. This is for patients who have at least had 2 lines of therapy. It had to be at least 1 rituximab-containing regimen, at least 1 BTK inhibitor. Patients have to be progressing, obviously, symptomatic, progressing. That's always the idea. Loncastuximab is given intravenously, 6 infusions once a month, and that's pretty much all it is. Even though it's an antibody, it's a little bit different than rituximab in the sense that it attacks CD19 instead of CD20, so a different marker in the membrane. But it also has a payload. So not only the antibody binds the malignant cell, it actually injects the payload in the malignant cell and kills it from the inside. So activates the immune system from the outside, very much like rituximab does, but also kills the cell from the inside with this payload. We have not seen flares so far. We have not seen infusion reactions. The infusion is about an hour, right? So very interested study, and this is the one that we have, the further along in the developments. The sample size is about 30 patients. So we are probably about 6 or 7, if I'm not mistaken. The other late development study is the study with epcoritamab. Epcoritamab is what a new family of medications called bispecific antibodies. And I don't think you heard Dr. Trotman mentioning this during her lecture a little bit earlier. So this is a bispecific antibody, actually binds to CD20, but also binds to T cells. And the idea is to bring the T cells closer to the cancer cells so they can be killed more efficiently. This study is being led by Dr. von Keudel from Beth Israel Deaconess, also located in Boston. And the collaborators for this study will be Dr. Anderson at UT Southwestern and Dr. Dittes at UNC. Actually, the site initiation visit with UNC just happened last week, and it will be coming up for initiation visit at UT Southwestern very shortly too. So this is fully approved now, accepted by the FDA, so okay to proceed. The IRB at Dana-Farber already approved it. So, as you know, we're just in the last budgeting, coordination, documentation, try to get the drug into the pharmacy, hopefully in the next couple of months. So we'll be able to start accruing in that study very soon. So this is another study. It doesn't have an NCT yet because it's not fully registered. It has to be formally approved, and then we will get a clinical trials ID for this study. The last study on late development is the ZEBRA study. This is a study that is being led by Dr. Andy Brannigan at MGH, also located in Boston, and it's a combination of zanubrutinib for 15 months and 4 cycles of ENDA-R. So we're kind of going under, behind the steps of the BROM study in Canada, which are doing 1 year of acalabrutinib and 6 cycles of ENDA-R. So we're doing 15 of zanu and then 4 cycles of ENDA-R. That's the idea. This is frontline. So loncastuximab and epcoritamab, they're all in relapse disease. This is specifically on frontline patients. And the collaborators are UT Southwestern and Colorado Blood Cancer Institute with Dr. Mattis. So the FDA has already, so I sent these slides about a month ago. So now the FDA has given us the okay to proceed. So the next step is actually IRB submission. And then we will proceed with the study. So these studies are studies that were already in the process of being planned, and I think it's easy to make them network, right? And then we will be developing now studies from scratch as the network, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So we have a couple of studies. One of them is the Prove It study. So some of you here might be aware of a trial that we're doing, combining pirtobrutinib with venetoclax in patients with Waldenstrom's, and this is in relapse patients. They were planning this study with pirtobrutinib, venetoclax, and rituximab. It's going to call the Prove It study. This is going to be for frontline. So essentially, after the ZEBRA study completes, this is going to be the second study to be right after that. And Dr. Palomba from Sloan Kettering is the lead for this study. We're still in conversations with the company. The company has already approved the budget for this study, but has not been submitted to the FDA just yet. So we're in that process, of trying to get this. That's what is called early development. It's not a late development. And the other one is a study that is being led by Dr. Kapoor at the Mayo Clinic. It's an anti-BCMA bispecific antibody, so very much like EPCO, that is targeting CD20. This is another bispecific antibody, but it's targeting BCMA. BCMA is a specific antibody. It's a specific antigen in the membranes of specifically plasma cells. In patients with Waldenstrom's, the malignant cells in patients with Waldenstrom's tend to have a high level of BCMA. And again, this is going to be for late relapse, meaning at least 2 lines of therapy. So, as you can see, a portfolio of a combination of targeted agents, and on the other hand, immunotherapies, right? I think this is where the future of clinical trials are, at least in the United States. And all of these are, phase 2 studies. And most of these agents are already approved by the FDA for other conditions. They are being just repurposed specifically for Waldenstrom patients. And most of the times, these agents are being repurposed because of their mechanism of action, but because of the nature of Waldenstrom's, typically we're trying to do less intensity, shorter duration type of studies, right? So that's essentially the way we want to move ahead. During the initial meeting in October, what a lot of our colleagues felt the ideal clinical trial would be is a novel mechanism of action, right? So that's a lot of these agents are actually relatively new. Trying to avoid chemotherapy exposure. Some of them are not. And then limited duration, right? So trying to avoid indefinite duration therapies. So that's the idea. So all these trials actually will be funded by pharmaceutical companies. So the funding of the study itself is going to be via pharmaceutical companies, which is how most clinical trials are run in this country. The pharmaceutical companies will provide the funding for all the different centers, depending on which center decides to participate. So my initial dream was to be able to open a trial in 10 or 15 centers at the same time. That's what I would love to happen. But the regulatory constraints in the United States makes it so very difficult to do something like that. So instead, what we're going to do is essentially work together so we can then create nodes of clinical trials. So it's going to be, for example, the LONCA study is going to be 3 or 4 centers. And then the EPCO study is going to be 3 or other 4 centers. And we're not essentially competing with each other, but rather kind of supplementing each other's efforts. And that's essentially the way it works at this time. The model might change in the future to make it more extensive, the way I envision it in the first place. But it will take a little bit more work to be able to create that from a regulatory perspective. Again, it's not the patients, it's not the investigators, it's not the pharmaceutical companies either. It's actually the regulatory stuff, issues that make an effort of this nature a bit more challenging. Now, there are other efforts in terms of research besides the clinical trials efforts, which I think that was the initial idea. But during the initial meeting in October, there were 2 other sub-projects that came out, which I think make a lot of sense in Waldenstrom's. So one of them is to create a clinical database for patients with Waldenstrom's. And there are a lot of databases in the country that can be used as we are right now. But they all have different structures and different purposes. And I think the database, the clinical database for Waldenstrom's is going to kind of fill a gap that exists currently. I'm going to try to make this as understandable as possible. So there are a lot of different databases that look at the disease from an epidemiological perspective, meaning, who has it, when do they have it, how long it takes for the patients to pass, and what other, zip code, and, they're married or not, things like that. So this is a good database, and you have the SEER database, you have the National Cancer Database, there are thousands of patients' data there, but they don't really give you any good idea of what they're getting for the first line, what they're getting for the second line, how long does it last, what were their markers, right, what the prognostic markers are, what the laboratory values are. That is not included in those databases. So we can get a good idea about the incidence, the prevalence, the mortality, but that's pretty much all we do for epidemiological data. There's other databases that are based on claims, like Medicare, and things like that, like insurances and things of that nature. But those also, can give us an idea of what patients are getting, but they don't have any clinical data in there. If somebody has anemia, if somebody has hyperviscosity, neuropathy, amyloidosis, big Neal syndrome, that doesn't exist there. So the databases that exist currently are very useful, but not useful for clinical purposes, are useful for economical analysis, are useful for epidemiological analysis, but not precisely for clinical purposes. I think that's the gap that this database is actually aiming at kind of filling, right? So we can understand truly what the treatment patterns are in the United States, what the outcomes are for patients in the United States. And I think the most important part is not each and every question will be answered by a trial. So there's going to be a lot of questions. Actually, most of the questions that we want to answer in patients with Waldenstrom's cannot be answered with clinical trials, right? So I think this database can actually help to do that. And the leads at this time are Dr. Kapoor from the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Sawala from Ohio State, and Dr. Pongas from the University of Miami. We have been having a number of different meetings over the last several weeks. We have already come up with a database that actually makes a little bit of sense. And we are going to do a 10-year cohort database. And that's the idea. All these will be retrospective. The idea is if we can create reasonable treatment patterns, outcomes, data that is good quality, then we can actually create a prospective database that will be maintained. And then obviously that needs a specific funding, because we need database managers and things of that nature. But so that's the initial thought. This is an important piece of what we're going to do in addition to clinical trials. And the other components of this is a biorepository. The biorepository, essentially what it is sending samples of patients, usually bone marrow and blood, to a place where they basically take the samples and they store them. They take the bone marrow, they take the blood, they separate the different types of cells, they separate the DNA, and they basically store them for future use for research, right? So what they do in Europe, which I think is pretty cool, and we're gonna kind of mimic that, is when they run a clinical trial, they decide which center is going to be the biorepository center. So it's usually one center, centralized, and all the different participants in the study send the samples, right? If you get a bone marrow biopsy, let's say at beginning of the trial, and then maybe a year later, and then 2 years later, right? So you get different samples, blood and marrow, all that gets sent to this centralized center, and they are kept there. And they're kept there for future use. In the future, there's going to be a lot of different studies that can come from specific, from these samples. So initially, I talked to a number of different centers in Boston, and nobody has space, actual physical space, right? So Dana-Farber, MGH, Brigham, I mean, I looked and I asked and I talked to different people, and it was so interesting. So I started reaching out into the network, and actually MD Anderson seems to actually be able to hopefully provide this type of service. And we already met, and Dr. Thomas, Shiva Thomas, I think probably she's around here, or she will be around. She's going to be the lead for that specific project, And I think in that sense, we can also have, different members of the Waldenstrom community engaged into the whole process as a database, as a clinical trial participant, as an investigator, in the biorepository, to be able to actually make this work, right? So this is, in a nutshell, right, what we are trying to do. And again, the steps at the beginning are probably smaller than what anybody would like them to be. And it's crazy how costly these efforts are, So, I mean, I really would like to thank the foundation for the support that they are providing to this effort. But if we want to do something more sustainable, I think the effort will need to be, more sustained and continued over time. So, in addition to the foundation, which I think obviously they are the main drivers of what we do, because we do share the vision and the mission up to some degree. There are going to be other different funds that have, and this is just a small, group of the fund, or the different families that have been supporting the network in different facilities and in different ways. And again, so the whole purpose is to try to be able to create this network and to make it functional and to make it sustainable, so we can at the end impact the lives of the patients, right? And that's essentially at the end of the day everybody's job around here. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. It's a little bit short, but I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have. Thanks.
I'll be brave and ask the first question.
Please.
So it would be wonderful if we could have gotten to your vision of multiple centers, because one of the difficulties in people participating in clinical trials is often the distance that they have to travel in order to have their first consult, and maybe even go several times a year for blood work or biopsies. Is there any possibility of a midterm solution such that maybe you could go for your blood work to the closest center that was in the network, whether or not they were a sponsor of the particular trial? Any thought to just making it a little easier transportation-wise and distance-wise to expand patient participation?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the issue here, so testing, laboratory testing, when you're off study, so the study has two components. Any trial has two components. You have the treatment components, and if we're thinking about, finite treatments, there's going to be a component that is only follow-up. You're still in the study, you're not getting treated. So, you have 2 years of therapy and then 4 years of follow-up, 6 years of study, just to give you an idea. So my sense is during the active trial participation in which, you have to see the physician, you have to be examined, you have to get labs for safety to see if you're tolerating the drugs and evaluating adverse events. I think it's going to be difficult. That can be done, outside of where the investigators are. For follow-ups, there may be a difference. And actually we're allowing that in some clinical trials. Currently, we're allowing, for example, patients instead of to come back every 3 months, they come back every 6, and they have just a blood work, in the interim locally, right? So we're trying to maybe help a little bit on that perspective. The other approach that we are following now, and we started one study at Dana-Farber using this, is where, for example, we're doing this study in neuropathy, in which we are combining acalabrutinib, which is the study drug, and rituximab, which is standard. So we were able to, for example, for patients who come from far away, we give them the acalabrutinib, but they can actually get the rituximab at their local physician, right? So as long as they sign specific contracts and agreements, because it's a standard treatment. But that will apply only to standard therapies, right? So for example, in the pirtobrutinib venetoclax rituximab study, that will apply only to rituximab. That will not apply to pirto and venetoclax, right? Because those are frontline treatments. Those are not approved for frontline treatments. Those are investigational for the purpose of that study. So I don't think investigational drugs will be given outside of the actually participating centers. So I would say standard therapies, we're going to aim for those to be provided locally. In follow-up, we're going to aim to have the local labs accepted for follow-up. And that might ease up things a little bit to patients. Maybe not as much as we would like it to, but at least up to some degree.
Thank you, Dr. Castillo. I mean, we're really excited about the Clinical Trials Network and expanding the availability of trials for patients and the collaboration that's going to occur. It's amazing what you're trying to do. My hat's off to you. I know it's going to be a mammoth task, so I give you a lot of credit for taking it on. So my question is, for clinical trials, once they're registered, like if we go to clinicaltrials.gov, will there be any designations so we know which ones are WMNet associated?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, that's ideal, right? So ideally, we will try to put that maybe in the title, right? Like WMNet 1, like the ECWM does, right? So something of that nature. That's a great idea. So we can actually submit some amendments for the loncastuximab and the EPCOR study. So there will be WMNet 1, WMNet 2, and at least just to get an idea of that this is related to the network.
Great. I mean,
point.
We're just trying to find
I think that's
trials
fair.
that are good for patients, but we don't want to say, well, just look at WMNet ones. But if it fits your needs and it's WMNet, bonus.
Exactly. No, I understand. I think that's a fair, it's a fair resource. I'll bring that up to the team.
I have a question about the availability of these clinical trials. They seem to be very U.S.-centric.
It's all U.S. at this time, yes.
I understand. That's great.
Yeah.
But as we move on from tribalism to globalism, will you see one day where there's an international effort? There's a lot more patients around the world than there are in one country, right? I know it's a nightmare scenario because there's lots of people have silos and
So, I mean, at least from the regulatory perspective, at this time, it will be impossible, right? Because, for example, if Dana-Farber is the sponsor of one specific study, I think we can, easily coordinate with at least maybe 4 or 5 different centers in the United States. Once you're talking about outside the United States, that's a complete different regulatory ballgame.
Okay.
And that might be a little bit more difficult.
There's no solutions to removing these barriers?
Yeah, so what could be done, and this is something that I'm in close, conversations with Christian Buski. He's the doctor in Ulm who basically is the lead of the European consortium, is that sometimes what we could do is maybe run 2 parallel studies with similar designs and then pull the data later, right? So obviously that will imply, coordination between different networks and agreements and a lot of that stuff. But that really, to follow your point, I mean, really kind of leaves every other country that doesn't have a network kind of behind, right, up to some degree, right? For example, if Asia doesn't have a network, then how is that going to work for them, right? So what we could potentially promote in any case is depending on how this works, right? The creation of other networks at different places, and then have a coordination at that level. But as it stands currently, that's going to be extremely difficult. Yeah.
So I have a question. I'm thinking about whether I'd be eligible for a trial or not. I have no idea what mutations I have. Is it possible to learn a mutation in liquid blood?
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously, as we move ahead with different trials, some trials might need that you have a specific mutation or not. At this time, we had a couple of studies that were specifically geared to patients with CXR mutations, for example, right? And the study itself will check, right, that they will allow to check that mutational status. At this time, I'm not aware of any other trial looking at specific subtype of mutations, but I can see how in the future we might, right? You heard, a lecture earlier about the TP53 mutations and how that can affect the disease. So it's very possible that at some point we will have a specific dedicated study for patients with specific mutations. So as of today, the mutational testing, still the best place to test for mutations is the bone marrow, still. And this is data actually that we at Dana-Farber generated. There have been a study in which we took samples from the marrow and the peripheral blood, and we ran the same genomic testing in both. And what we notice is if somebody has not been treated previously, just treatment naive, the marrow and the blood for MYD88 mutation matches very nicely. So so there's not a lot of false negative or false negatives is the main problem. False positives almost never occur. But false negatives are very common in the blood. But when you do it in the frontline setting, really the matching is very nice. But in the minute you start getting some type of treatments, the signal gets lost in the blood. So we could, in theory, run the tests in blood. And if it's positive, then we know you have the mutation because there's no false positives. But if it's negative in the blood, we really do not know because the rate of false negatives is very high in the blood. So for purposes of any genomic testing for Waldenstrom's, I think the bone marrow is still the best sample. Now, there are other conditions, and I want you just to be aware. There are other conditions, like CLL, like some other types of problems, in whom the blood is an amazing, source of data for genomics, but not so much in Waldenstrom's. Lisa.
Congratulations on this colossal collaborative project for envisioning it, bringing it to fruition. It's no surprise, knowing that you lead with partnership always between patient and provider, that you would want to create partnership across the nation in all of these institutions. I'm curious because we're the missing partner here. This only works if we all raise our hands and say, get me into one of those on one of those dots. So we're part of this equation, and I'm wondering if you might just leave us with a word of wisdom here. What should we as Waldenstrom patients do in order to get there and onto your map?
Yeah.
What questions should we be asking in the exam room? Or what kinds of things should we be thinking about if we feel hesitancy or fear about joining a clinical trial? And since I'm on a clinical trial, full transparency, talk to me later if you're worried about it, because I'm a poster child.
No, thank you for the question. I mean, I think clinical trial participation should be a consideration for any patients with Waldenstrom's, regardless if you're in the front line, early relapse, late relapse. I think there's opportunities to participate in clinical trials at any different levels. The decision of participating in clinical trials, however, is very personal. Right? I mean, it's going to be very difficult that I will tell you, oh, yeah, this is the only thing I want you should do. I don't think that's the way, at least I operate in my clinic as the patients who, come and see me. That I'm more like, these are all the options, pros and cons, and that might play against clinical trial participation sometimes. But I mean, I think is better for patients to make a decision in an educated manner. But what I can tell you is, when a patient gets into a clinical trial, things are a little bit different. And that is a good and a bad thing. So patients stop being patients and become participants. And the physicians stop being physicians and become investigators. And by that, each and every action taken as part of the interaction is, mandated by a protocol. So we need to follow a protocol. And every participant needs to be treated in a very similar way, following the same protocol, so we can teach the rest of the world, how this medication truly works and how do we understand the side effects, how do we manage the side effects. We need to follow these protocols. So what I can tell you is that most of the study of these medications that I mentioned, most of these medications, even though they are new for Waldenstrom's, they are not new medications, right? Most of these medications are already either FDA approved or soon to be FDA approved. So these are medications that the side effects are very well known, and most of them, sometimes for years. So before, for example, for venetoclax, before we started the venetoclax trial, venetoclax had been approved already for like 3 years for another leukemia, right? So they're not totally unknown, first-in-human type of trials, number one. So that gives you, might or might not give you some comfort. The second part is patients in trials tend to be poke and probed a little bit more often. And again, that is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time, because you can say, well, I need to be having more blood work and more testing and things like that. And that's important because the data needs to be complete, right? So if we're going to teach somebody, a different doctor somewhere in the world, how to treat patients with this disease, we need to have complete data to understand how the medication works. So on one hand, maybe more testing, but on the other hand, we are following your disease so closely, right? And I think somebody else mentioned earlier, says almost like a concierge service, right? So the clinical trial group, the physicians, the nurses, the clinical research coordinators, everybody will be available to you 24/7, to answer questions, to answer problems, concerns, middle of the night. So it doesn't really matter. We're always there to support it. So if it's true that maybe there's more interventions, but also there's also very close monitoring, right? So I think, and the third part, which I think is also an important part, is the reason we go into these trials, or we design these trials, is because there are probably already some preliminary data, that gives us a good idea that this is going to work. We cannot promise that it will work. And when you sign a consent form with us, I will tell you, I do not know if it's going to work, right? But there's always, preliminary data, either from the laboratory or for prior diseases or for prior conditions or for our patients, prior reports that show some efficacy. And that's why we are thinking that this study could be, potentially efficacious in somebody too. So we are not going into these trials typically in a blind manner. So we know the drug, we know how it works in other conditions. We just want to know how it works in Waldenstrom's. And for that reason, close monitoring is always important. So again, you can look at all these three things, as a pro or as a con, right? Depending on where you are in your journey. But all I can say is, participating in a clinical trial is the only way to really work this, forward, right? Anything that you're using today is zanubrutinib, Benda-R, ibrutinib, all these were clinical trials in the past. Somebody went there, did the trial, and that's why, people then benefit from it.
How do you rule out what other medical conditions the patient participating in your trial might have? And you're dealing with a population that isn't in their 20s or 30s, so we're not coming to you with a blank slate. Mm-hmm. We don't just have Waldenstrom's. So do you weed out those people who have too many other issues?
That's a good question. So any trial has a list of potential inclusion criteria and a list of exclusion criteria, right? And depending of where the patient is, so we need to have what we call a screening visit. So, for example, if you are interested in a clinical trial, then you will reach out to the investigator, and you will come to an office visit, and that visit will be the screening. And the screening will review all your medications, all your other conditions. We'll examine you. We'll get a big, comprehensive blood work, and addition imaging if it's necessary, right? So we do all this type of testing to really understand if you're a good, match for the trial or not. Again, How many people that come to see us are not candidates because of comorbidities? Very few. And the reason for that, I would say, is because we try to be as inclusive in trials as possible. So what do we gain by putting only 50-year-olds with normal liver, normal and hemoglobins of 10? I mean, we need to bring in patients that are representative of our disease. In the patients who are representative of our disease are patients in their 60s and 70s, and all that. So we need to include those patients. And because if we do the inclusion or the exclusion criteria too stringent or too strict, we might know how this medication works in patients who are in excellent shape, right? So how does that help anybody, right? So there are other conditions in which you want that, right? And again, I don't want to minimize other trials for other conditions. There are some trials for some conditions you want to see only people who are in better shapes. But for our trials, we're very permissive. So, something will have to be really, really, really wrong, right, with your health state for us to say, I don't think you're a clinical trial participant or a candidate.
It seems to me that when you discuss who's eligible for these trials, it's not something like me who's had one round of chemotherapy and is just doing fine. It sounds like you actually suddenly have to get really sick, and the clinical trial has to time with the period in your life when you're really sick. Is that correct?
Yeah. So typically, So we don't usually treat patients who are doing great, right? So the patient's disease has to be progressing, and the patient has to have some specific, symptoms so patient need therapy.
Right. The timing has to coincide.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And again, that is a good thing and a bad thing too, right? Because if you are progressing and you have the right study in front of you, then that's perfect. But yeah, there have been situations in which, patients come to see us and we don't have a trial at that moment for that situation the patient is in, right? So yeah, it has to do a little bit of timing. But that's the importance of having trials in different parts of the country that are looking at patients in frontline setting patients, early relapses, late relapses, all the different settings. And in that way, there are many options. So that's where the portfolio needs to be, up to some degree, very kind of inclusive of the different potential scenarios. All right. Well, thank you very much. There's one more question, please. Would that be the last question, Carl? All right, please.
Being Canadian, I understand that doesn't sound like this is going to move into Canada anytime in the near future. What are other restrictions for Canadians going down and participating in these trials?
I mean, Canadians come to United States to participate in studies. The problem is, who's covering the expenses of the study, because the expenses in the study are two types. We have the standard expenses and the research-related expenses. So, for example, visits to the physician, laboratory, CBCs and CMPs and IgMs and CAT scans and bone marrow biopsies, all that is actually standard care. So that will be billed to the patient's insurance, right? That the clinical trial doesn't cover those expenses. Clinical trials typically cover the expenses associated with the medications that are investigational, right? The sampling of the patients and the collection of the sampling and the storage of those samples for future research. So there's a specific research activities that will be covered by the trial, but most of the activities are standard. Right, so if as a Canadian patient, you're going to come to Dana-Farber or any other place in the United States to participate, the standard expenses need to be, need to come from you, from you or your insurance need to be able to cover something like that. And that makes it obviously complicated because it's so expensive. If you don't have insurance coverage in the United States.
Right. Okay, thanks.
No problem. All right. Thank you very much for your time.